Wonderful. Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you for this invitation. And I too want to add my congratulations to the Biohub as well. I've really enjoyed this symposium, and it's incredible what the Biohub has accomplished over a 5-year period. So everyone at the Biohub should be very proud of what you accomplished in this time period. It's also been a really busy week. It's been our 15th anniversary as well a couple of days ago. And I had a great meeting this morning at the Biohub in person. And I think there are lots of ways in which the Biohub and Janelia Research Campus can work together in the future. I'm also really glad. Originally, I came to the Bay Area. This event was going to be in person. Next slide. But also I can extend my congratulations to David Julius and to UCSF. This was a really wonderful honor. David and I joined UCSF together as assistant professors a number of years ago. And anyway, David's a great friend. He's a great scientist. And I was just so excited to hear about that announcement this morning. And next slide. Although I moved to Virginia, I'm still a Giants fan, and right down the road from the Biohub, yesterday the Giants won the National League West Championship, the first time in nearly a decade. So again, it's been a really exciting week for the Bay Area. Next slide. The Biohub model is really founded on collaboration. I think you've heard this theme throughout the day, but I think what they've accomplished in the Biohub is very special, bringing scientists and investigators from different campuses, university environments around the Bay Area together to work together collaboratively in science. And I think this was one of the founding principles and a great model of the Biohub. And as you can see from today's talks, I think the Biohub has catalyzed something very special in the Bay Area. And in addition to this interinstitutional collaboration, I think you've heard today in the next slide that with even in the research labs at the Biohub, fantastic research has been produced through collaborations. And I think you heard that in the last two talks from Angela on Tabula Sapiens and open science and all the work going on with virus research and epidemiology, all made possible by this collaborative spirit that is very much built into the operational principles of how the Biohub works. Next slide. And even in recent times, I saw this on the website, we're all reinventing how we think about doing collaborative research. And, now a lot of this can occur remotely as well. I mean, we've had to work in this environment for the last couple of years. And I think this is going to add even a new dimension of how scientists collaborate, not just locally, but throughout the world. Next slide. So on this theme of collaboration, I mean, we know this is a critical way in which scientific discoveries are made. And how to foster this is really part of the secret sauce of how we develop an institute or how we develop even individual laboratories. And a collaboration can be as small as 2 people. Famous example here is shown on the left, Matt Messelson and Frank Stahl, who, of course, did the Messelson-Stahl experiment that demonstrated, provided evidence for the semi-conservative replication of DNA. And kind of like DNA, Frank and Matt actually kind of worked in such a complementary fashion, like 2 intertwining strands of DNA, and complemented one another in their knowledge base and their styles of science to produce the famous work. In other cases, collaborations are much bigger teams. We heard some of this today during many talks, but one example here is an effort to detect gravitational waves by the LIGO project. And this just shows a small subset of some of the graduate students who worked on the project, but this involved collaborations throughout the world. And biology right now is poised at this really interesting time where collaborations as small as 2 or as large as global teams can make an impact in life science research. Next slide. But beyond the scientific output, I mean, collaborations are just part of the fundamental joy of being a scientist. And I think this is captured in these images too. Matt and Frank met when they were in their mid-20s. They're now in their 90s, and this friendship has lasted between the two of them over decades. And again, I think for early career scientists, being able to work with other people and celebrate the victories, and also have friends to work together when times are tough, which happens in experimental science, is really fundamental for the scientific profession. Oh yeah, next slide, please. And indeed, the way we often project science to the public, or many people think of what a scientist is a lone scientist working on a microscope looking at a petri dish. But I think you heard through the day that that's really not at all what a great scientific environment is like. This is a picture from our lab retreat a couple years ago. And I think we need to convey to students and the general public that it's the spirit of working together that really makes the profession great and produces great scientific outcomes. So next slide. So for the rest of the talk, what I'd like to discuss is we all believe in the power of collaboration, but do we have a credit system and a publication system that is well matched for the type of science that needs to be done today, in particular type of collaborative science, or has it strayed off course? And to some extent, I will argue that it has strayed off course, but I also will share an optimistic message that I think the scientific community can take ownership of this and really think of new ways to steer our evaluation system and publication system in the right direction as well. So next slide, please. So you heard a lot about big data during the talks today. And in this era of big data, it's kind of surprising in some ways. The metrics of credit for evaluation have been shrinking. So I'll give you 3 examples here. First of all, we now live in an era, as you've heard from many talks today, where you can do many experiments and gather data in many ways easier than in past times. But yet graduate students and postdocs are writing fewer papers, at least as products of this work, than in the past. And there are more authors now on papers, but in reality, few authorship positions are considered to be important for career advancement. There are also more journals out there, but few are considered to be high impact by the scientific community. So in the next few slides, I'll discuss some of these points. Next slide. So this was kind of a study that I did of publications by UCSF graduate students. First of all, in the early 80s, that was a time around when I was a graduate student, and in more recent times, although this was done a few years ago. And what this study showed is that the time to graduation increased during this few decade time interval, but also the time from entering graduate school to producing a first author publication also rose dramatically from 4.7 to 6 years. 6 years being effectively the the time limit that we'd like to strive for a PhD degree. Also, the number of first author publications by graduate students decreased, even though now there are co-first author publications that didn't exist in earlier times. And although it seems that many trainees are strive to get cell science and nature papers, and in fact is less likely now than it was in the past time. And beyond all these quantitative data, I think something that we all should be concerned about is just conferring and encouraging a joy in scholarly communication with our trainees. But I think the atmosphere is that many now are very worried about writing papers and whether they're going to be accepted, and it actually becomes a very a point of concern for many trainees today. Next slide, please. Second point, number of authors per paper. This actually is just taken from the latest issue of Nature, and you're not intended to read this in detail, but the blue in the blue is the authorship list from biology papers in this last issue. And as you can see, just in general, that there are a lot of authors in these life science papers that are coming out. And yet what our community most values are these first author positions and corresponding author positions. Now, there are new ways of sharing that. There are co-first author, shared co-first author or co-corresponding authors. And the number of co-first authors or co-corresponding authors are shown in these numbers associated with these papers. I'll come back to the number of authors on a paper in a later slide as well. Next slide, please. And in terms of, where publications are and how they're valued by our scientific community, there's certainly an emphasis right now on a journal hierarchy and what are considered to be high-profile publications. Now, I'm not a fan of impact factor, to be clear, but in many places in our scientific community, that is a metric that is valued. And this just shows a graph of impact factor over, possibly a little bit over maybe 12 years or so. And you can see that if there is the word nature in the title, the impact factor has been increasing over time. And if you happen to be a journal of, in many of these cases, these are journals run by scientific societies or where scientists are, framing the editorial boards. This impact factor has been going increasingly down over time, and I think this is something that our scientific community, should be concerned about. Next slide, please. So, this current need that seems to be prevalent in our community to get high-profile publications, I think has led to some aspects that are kind of less than desirable. So first of all, although they're fantastic to read, many of these cell science or nature papers have become really massive publications of enormous amount of data that takes years and years and years to accumulate. And I'll provide some data for this later. And to accumulate all that data, this has been leading to a trend for longer, at least a contributing factor of longer training periods for our postdocs and our students. I showed you these papers with many, many authors on them. But in some cases, these involve collaborations of tool builders and biologists. And sometimes tool builders provide data for what is primarily a biology paper, or conversely, biologists provide some data for what's primarily a method paper. And there is this feeling sometimes that contributions can get lost in these mega papers with many authors. And of course, the other thing that we all realize is that many people are now spending an excessive amount of time either trying to get into a top journal, sometimes with multiple submissions, or spending a year or more revising a paper to get into a top journal. But many of these efforts also are unsuccessful. And this is, the next statement is somewhat of a qualitative statement, but I tend to feel that scientists are often focusing on strategically on figuring out what it takes to get a Cell Science or Nature paper, rather than really just fundamentally focusing on the scientific problem that they're trying to solve. And because many of these papers are not even going out for review, trainees often now feel somewhat discouraged that their careers are resting in the hands of editors at journals, and even deciding whether the paper will get reviewed or not. So next slide, please. So one can ask, how did we get to this state? What happened? Next slide. Well, I think the answer to that question is somewhat related to this, and I'll explain this in a moment, but how did rents in around the Biohub and in San Francisco get so crazy? Well, if you ask this question, the answer is pretty simple. There's limited amount of real estate in San Francisco. It's surrounded by water on most sides. And in this limited real estate, which isn't growing any, many people want to live here. And so the desire to move to San Francisco with limited real estate creates this escalation in the cost of housing prices and in rent. Next slide. Well, I think a similar situation is also occurring in our publishing world as well. There, at least our scientific community, is valuing a few journals that are of high profile. And these journals are essentially publishing the same or fewer papers than they did a few decades ago. And this just shows a graph of this for Cell and Nature. And even in the case of Journal of Cell Biology, the number of papers surprisingly actually decreased compared to the past. So the real estate, if you like, of getting into these journals is limited. It hasn't been growing. And as I'm sure we're all aware, the scientific community itself has been growing, and the number of scientific papers that are being published has been growing considerably over the last few decades. So there are more scientists publishing more papers and trying to get into this limited real estate market. Next slide. So this is in fact created a kind of what I would call artificial scarcity. I use the word artificial because in many ways, technology has improved in terms of publishing. We're now in the internet era. We're not shipping manuscripts in the mail anymore. And conceivably, the technology is getting better so that more papers could be published in a journal. But the limitation of space in these journals, the more difficult it is to get into a journal, the more desirable it becomes because it becomes a precious commodity, and the harder and harder scientists often try to get into it. So, what this is also drives, is shown in the next slide, is, of course, it takes, an interesting finding, no doubt, to get into, some of the top journals. But in addition to just an exciting finding, it has to be supported by a large amount of data as well. I mean, some of these papers are really like shock and awe studies with just a tremendous amount of data. In many ways, this is good. I mean, it makes for very compelling and complete stories. But, the amount of data is just shown and analyzed here in terms of the panels that are published in these journals. The number of figures has not changed over several decades, but the number of data panels, which we did analyze, are kind of proxies of data, have been increasing in the main paper in all these journals, as well as in the supplemental material, which didn't exist in the 1980s. So more data is needed, and therefore more time. And next slide, more authors are contributing. Also, the author list has been increasing over time as well. Next slide. So there have been some innovations in the paper, the concept of the paper, to accommodate this. And to some extent, all these things are reasonable. There are now supplemental figures, tables, and methods as ways of adding more data into papers. There are shared first and last authorships, author contribution sections as well. All these things are good. The main point is I don't think they're sufficient for really thinking about what modern publications are. And there are also some glaring problems in this current environment where authors are submitting to the very highest journal, getting rejected, going to another journal, and then to another journal. In addition to requiring lots of scientist time in doing this, we're effectively paying editors at many journals to examine all these papers. And our whole scientific community is also in many cases engaging in multiple rounds of review of the same paper. Plus, to some extent, because much of this peer reviewing is not really transparent, we don't really even know, I would say, the magnitude of, the problem even of, the multiple rounds of submission that are going on right now. Next slide, please. So, the real question is, where do we go from here? I think, the future of scholarly communication is going to look different. What that future is like, I think is something that, I or even the community doesn't really know as of yet. But, we will need to get to a new stable state, and that's going to occur in steps and maybe experiments as well. It's not going to come all at once. So I'd like to share some thoughts on steps that can help with this transition to make a new evolving science communication system. And I think I'm going to talk about preprints, referee preprints, and even new ways of thinking of CVs. I think the bigger message I want to share with you is not the details of these mechanisms, but that the scientific community really needs to take ownership and responsibility for thinking about what the future of scientific publishing and communication should look like. And in the next slide, I'll go to preprints. I think a good example of this was a meeting that was held in 2016 at HHMI. Harold Varmus, who was one of the keynote speakers today, was kind of co-organizer with me, along with Daniel Cohen-Ramus and Jessica Polka, in organizing this meeting. But this meeting brought together junior scientists, senior scientists, funding agencies, university leaders, journal editors, various thought leaders to really ask this one question, which is, should biologists adopt preprints? And this discussion was held over 2 days. And the outcome of this meeting, or the answer to this question, was far from obvious, even for the co-organizers. And the reason for this was, first of all, preprints had been tried or discussed earlier in the life science community. And also, there were many barriers. Many journals did not accept work submissions that were previously pre-printed. Funding agencies didn't have policies for them. And even biologists themselves were skeptical about whether preprints would count as priority of discovery, or even whether the biology culture was so different from physics that it would take hold. Well, in the next slide, I think the encouraging thing also for many young scientists is that change can happen, and over a relatively short period of time, preprints, and it's not finished, but has evolved into something that has been adopted by biologists. And I would say the components that were required for this We're a great platform. A bioarchive developed by Cold Spring Harbor came out that was also funded by CZI. Policy change occurred in many scientific organizations and funding agencies. I also thank Francis Collins for his work on this. And also a period of cultural change within our own scientific community. Next slide. And of course, also a recent game changer has been COVID-19 itself, which we've discussed, which has fueled a recent growth to communicate science faster, even in the medical community, and led to an explosive growth of recent times about preprints. Next slide, please. So I think progress has happened. As an example, I'm no longer giving talks explaining what preprints are. I didn't know very much about preprints in 2014, and then gave town halls and other venue talks about them between 2015 and 17. Now, biologists pretty much know where they are. CZI requires them. Thank you for actively promoting this, CZI and Biohub. And if you don't know about preprints, I encourage you to go to ASAP Bio or also talk to colleagues who use them. Next slide. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this, but I will just say very, very briefly, a new evolution of where preprints are going is to actually add peer review onto them. And this is a way of giving authors feedback to improve the work. It adds, even potentially quickly adds additional rigor and correction. And it actually can be a mechanism of facilitating publication in a journal. So there are many venues of this. eLife is doing this. There are preprint journal clubs. There's a new organization called Scarcity. Next slide. There is also a new platform called Review Commons. I encourage you to look at this, but this is a way in which you can get peer review based upon a preprint and then submit to a consortium of journals who will look at the reviews and evaluate the manuscript and the reviews and offer a quick pathway to publication. Next slide. So I'd like to close with just thinking about ways of reimagining the CV. A lot of CVs contain a bibliography with a long list of publications like this. I don't think it's a sufficient way to convey the value of what and contributions of what scientists do. And I think we can also begin to experiment with new types of CVs. Next slide. So one thing that you've heard about already from other talks is thinking about work as a collection of a body of related communications, such as the preprint, a refereed preprint, the article, reviews that happen from the journal publication, software, data that is associated with the work. So instead of just citing one publication, one could imagine CVs with a richer collection of material that represent the body of work and its evolution. Next slide. So another idea, which is instead of a very big list of publications, is to think about how to curate the work to highlight kind of what scientists are most proud of, what they feel are their best contributions. HHMI has done this by asking for its evaluation scientists to pick their 5 most significant publications, which include a reference and a paragraph descriptor. And another idea I'm kind of intrigued by, and I would welcome comments by email or other mechanisms later, is to even further curate the publication and identify a result that is an exciting result within that publication, which could be featured in a more even visual and written description, such as a piece of data from the paper, a graphical summary that kind of illustrates its importance, and a paragraph descriptor. Next slide. I'll try to finish within 1 minute. So why think about this? Well, it kind of is an effort to move away from the journal citation to a result, which the result could be a discovery or a technology as the focus of achievement, because that is why we do science. It also further, asks the scientists to not just list a publication with a journal name, but really to, not just rely on the journal name as a value of the worth of the work, but to really identify a finding or a method and providing a clear explanation of its importance. And even it dissociates the result, from the publication, which may be valuable in a long list of publications where there are many contributions. So a scientist, even in a long author list, can feature their contribution, and it gives more tools and voice to the scientist rather than just a journal citation to describe his or her contribution. So I think what is the last slide, I just would like to say, I think, I hope, that all of you listening to this will also think about how to participate in this arrow, to develop ways in which we can think about a new scholarly system, publication system. And, through this effort, I think publishing will be very different a decade from now than what it is today. And also, in addition to the great scientific work that Biohub and CZI do, you're also doing great work in thinking through also how to disseminate work, how to share it with the community through open science. And I think institutes like you, and I think Janelia also, can help shape the future of open science and publication and evaluation for scientists. So with that, I thank you for the invitation. And again, congratulations, Biohub. It's been an amazing 5 years, and looking forward to what's going to happen next.